There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? What are some of these activities? In recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. In part, this was popularized by Wim Hof, the so-called Iceman, getting into cold showers, taking ice baths, exposing oneself to cold water of various kinds can in fact increase our levels of dopamine as well as the neuromodulator norepinephrine. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30 Fahrenheit or even low 40 Fahrenheit can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60 water or 50 water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40 water or 45 water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the quickening of the breath, the widening of the eyes, the feeling as if you can't catch your breath, and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. Now, this study that I mentioned earlier, human physiological responses to immersion into water of different temperatures, really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. What they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reach levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. It was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. To be totally honest, it does not matter for sake of dopamine release, because the dopamine release is triggered and then continues even after you get out of the cold water. This does appear to raise the baseline of dopamine for substantial periods of time, and most people report feeling a heightened level of calm and focus after getting out of cold water. So cold water exposure turns out to be a very potent stimulus for shifting the entire milieu, the entire environment of our brain and body, and allowing many people to feel much, much better for a substantial period of time after getting out of the ice bath or cold water of any kind than they did before. Now, you might ask how often to do this. Some people do this every day. It can be very stimulating, so typically doing it early in the day is going to be better. I don't necessarily recommend doing it right before sleep, but some people do it in the afternoon, and some people will indeed do that 7 days a week. Nonetheless, it's a basically zero cost. I mean, you need access to water of some sort, cold water, shower, etc. But basically zero cost way of triggering a long-lasting increase in dopamine without ingesting anything, no pharmacology whatsoever. Please, again, approach it with safety and caution in mind, but it is a very potent stimulus. Again, 250% of rise in baseline, 2.5 times rise in baseline rivals that of cocaine, which is really remarkable.